Queering Premodern Asia is a limited series by the Nuances podcast. I'm your host and producer, Lazu. I was finally able to record that interview with the scholar I mentioned last week, but I need a little bit more time to put everything together and present it to our next co-host. But as promised, I'm not going dark. Instead, I'm sharing an episode from another podcast that I think you might want to check out. Today's podcast feed drop is MX Asian American, which is hosted by our previous guest co-host, Karen Zhang. Karen was the co-host for episode 2, But Where Are the Lesbians? Similar to the Nuances podcast, MX Asian American explores the Asian American experience with guests from various career backgrounds and ethnic groups. In this episode, Karen and I talk about my Asian American experience as well as the limited series itself. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Karen on her podcast, MX Asian American. If you enjoy this episode, feel free to subscribe to MX Asian American wherever you listen.
Welcome back, everyone, to MX Asian American. Today we have Lazu. Lazu? Was that right?
Yeah, Lazu.
Okay. Could you introduce yourself to the listeners?
Yes. My name is Lazu. I am a singer, songwriter, producer, and podcaster. I am currently based in Southern California.
Woo, awesome. I like to start with my guests with their background. So could you tell us a little bit about how and where you grew up?
Yeah. I was born in Canada, but then my parents moved back to their homeland, which is a tiny African island named Mauritius. It's east of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean and is the only place a dodo bird ever lived. And if you've been on the internet, you've seen the underwater waterfall. That's also where that is.
Wow.
So I grew up there. It was very different from North America. Most of the population is of Indian or African descent. Mm-hmm. Chinese people were about 2% of the population. There's barely any white people unless you go into the specific expat enclaves. There's a few like local white people, and also the tourists. You know, the hotels are full of white people, but if you go into town, you barely see any.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I grew up surrounded by dark-skinned people. So I was a minority as a light-skinned, East Asian person. Mm-hmm. And then moving to here, I'm also a minority, but in a very different way.
Yeah. So when did you move to the States? Move back, I guess, to the States.
So I moved to Toronto first. I did my school there, and then I moved to the States in 2013.
So once you moved back to North America, what was the culture shock?
Toronto wasn't that much of a culture shock because it was so diverse on campus, and I lived really close to campus downtown. So it wasn't that much of a culture shock. I think I did learn that a few things that I thought were not real were real. And also I went to a baseball game like the first week with, I was in residence, and people were like, hey, we're going to see a baseball game. Have you seen a baseball game? And I'm like, no, I don't even know how this game is played. I just know they have a bat. So they're like, let's go watch a baseball game. The Blue Jays are playing against the Yankees. I'm like, okay. And so growing up in Mauritius, the only sports I would see on TV was soccer and maybe tennis, right? Uh-huh. And so I'm thinking, well, how different can it be, right? 90 minutes, worst case scenario. I'll be back home, and 4 innings later, I'm starting to get really bored. And I look around and I'm asking people, so how long do these games go on for? Like, what's the time limit? And they're like, there's no time limit. I'm like, what do you mean? And they're like, yeah, there's 9 innings. And I'm like, what inning are we? They're like, 4. I'm like, oh no, I will not make it.
That's so funny. I love how baseball is your... Me too, though. I just know they have bats, and I don't really know what's going on.
For somebody tried to explain it to me, and I'm like, why is it so complicated?
They're just running in a circle.
Yeah. Honestly, I still don't understand baseball, and when people make baseball references, I'm just clueless.
Oh yeah,
and
me
I've just
too.
resigned to the fact that I will never get sports metaphors.
Oh, me too. The only way to get me to understand sports is anime. Like, the only reason why I know, like, the rules to any sports is because I've watched an anime on it. But yeah, so you go to Toronto for school. Did you have any career aspirations? What did you decide to study?
Yeah, I was a nerd growing up. I was always both a creative and a nerd. So I was really interested in programming, so I went to do that. I got a computer science degree, but I was also secretly hoping to enter Canadian Idol, and then it got canceled the year I got there. And I
Wow.
was like, you know what? It was probably for the best. I probably would have embarrassed myself. But I did spend a lot of time writing songs and doing really crappy recordings on my laptop when I was not studying. I had no life outside of campus. I was either working on assignments or writing songs or
No,
playing
I love
shows.
that. It's really, that's interesting because I also had an idol aspiration when I was a kid, when I was like young. Who didn't? Um,
Right?
yeah, I would also just randomly. We had this app, Chinese karaoke app, and I would sing all the time on that app. And you would meet strangers in those like karaoke rooms, and
Oh,
people
cool.
would take turns singing. Yeah.
Do you still
Not
sing?
safe for underage people, but I do still sing, but you know, like as a hobby. um, yeah, but that's very interesting that you kind of straddled both, like the logical, quote unquote, and the creative mind.
Yeah.
Um, so after you graduate, you work for Apple.
Well,
No big
yeah,
deal.
I was at a startup and the startup got acquired. So
Okay.
then the whole team got acquired. You know, we got offers and they're like, we'll pay you to move down here. We want you to work on the Maps team. And it was kind of a no-brainer offer, you know.
Right.
If you graduate from computer science, you get a job from Apple, you go.
Oh yeah.
So I had never even considered moving to the US because I was already Canadian. You know, the paperwork just seemed like so much work, and Canada has free healthcare. Why would I bother? Um, but then you get a job from Apple, and you're like, I should probably
Maybe.
take it. I should probably take it. So moved down to Silicon Valley and did almost 5 years there. And then the creative bug kind of started, creeping in again. Also, part of the reason why I went into engineering and not something creative was because, Asian parents.
Yeah.
And
I sure do.
because Mauritius currency was, at the time, 1 Canadian dollar was about 25 rupees.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew that my parents were really like spending their savings on me. I needed to do something that was going to be able to make money and also going to be able to help pay for my brother, who was coming after me a few years.
Yeah.
So after 5 years working at Apple, my brother had graduated. Nobody was relying on me anymore. So I was like, okay, I can do something for myself now. And I was lucky enough to be able to do that. So I was like,
Eldest
not?
Asian daughter syndrome.
Are you also the eldest?
Yes, I am, but I am like, fuck that.
I love it.
I mean, because my parents they never pressured me or anything either.
Yeah.
So there's that. I do feel a little bit guilty about it, but presumably I'm going to be a full-time poet / professor, which, doesn't make any money. And I have 2 siblings who are younger than me. I'm counting on them, actually, to, provide for my parents.
You were the spoiled ones. You take care now.
Yeah, I literally took care of them when they were young, so now I get to be taken care of. So the creative bug hits you. How did you? I guess the decision to leave. Like, how was that, and what did you start doing after you left?
Yeah, it actually took a while to leave. Initially, I had no I had not even considered leaving, but what sparked it was I got passed on for a promotion and I got really pissed off about it. And
Boom.
I, at the time, I was just very angry and I thought it was because of that promotion.
Mm.
I went to therapy thinking that I, need to figure out my anger issues. And then in therapy, I realized that I was not angry about that promotion at all. I was angry because I didn't want to be there. I realized that, I was just suffocating in that corporate environment and that there were a lot of things that I wanted to do and that I couldn't do because I had a full-time job and I, had things that I had to do every day. And also I think it was just bugging me, but I didn't understand what was happening with me. So I assumed I was mad at the people at work. And then turns out I was just mad at myself. But once I realized that, my therapist was like, okay, so what do you want to do? And what would you need to do to make it happen? And so I started thinking about, okay, what do I really need? And then, all sorts of Asian things come through your head when you do that, right? Like, what are my parents going to think? What's the family going to think? Or everybody's going to freak out. Somebody's going to have depression and blame me for it.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, I had to work through a lot of that before I left. It took me about a year to plan my exit, to make sure that I transitioned all my responsibilities to other people. And yeah, like really plan financially, like how can I do that? Like, we sold a bunch of our stuff, we downsized. And then after we sold a bunch of stuff and my husband sold the house that he owned that we were in, we were able to travel. And I was able to go back home for 2 months, which, is not possible if you're working. So that was fun. And then I started learning to record my music at home because, paying producers to do your music is not very financially cost efficient. So I'm like, I got an engineering degree. How hard can it be, right? So started with YouTube videos and joined a bunch of groups on Facebook, learning from feedback from others. Like I would just post my stuff and people would give me feedback, some of it good, some of it questionable. And then over time, just learned to do it myself. And now I do everything here.
Yeah, well, I think the transition is amazing and all the like mental stuff you had to go through to actually allow yourself to do that. Yeah, sounds really hard, but
I mean, I still feel guilty about it. Don't get me wrong, but
oh damn, okay. But you're here.
I'm here.
But other than music production, you also have a podcast. Could you tell us a little bit about Nuances and how you got started, etc.?
Yeah, so in the music industry, there's not a lot of people who look like you and I who are visible. I mean, it's starting to change with K-pop, but in terms of Asian American, like Western grown Asians, there's not a lot going on.
I love how you phrase that. Western grown Asians.
So when I come across Asian people in the industry, when I'm going to conference and stuff, I always gravitate towards them because it's so rare. So I met my friend Ariadne in one of the online meetings back when it was pandemic times and everybody was on Zoom. And we decided to just have a Zoom, just the two of us, to talk about, just music and how it's been and all that. And we realized that there's a lot of experiences that we've had that were common. And I didn't know that these were common things that Asian people go through in America because I did not grow up in America, right? Like people confusing you with the other Asian or, stuff like that. And we realized that our experience in the music industry was not the same as white people's experience in the music industry. And we started talking more and more about what it means to be Asian American and her experience growing up on the borders of Texas and Mexico and what that experience was like and how that was different from the average Asian American experience. And we thought it might be cool to have a podcast to talk about the diverse experiences of Asian Americans. Particularly at the time, it was when Asian hate crimes were at an all-time high, and we thought it might be a way to humanize Asian people as not just a monolith, but we have stories that are similar to everybody else's, but also they're slightly different from everybody else's. So it started out as it would be good to humanize those stories for other people. But then as soon as we started recording, I realized that it was more a space for the Asian community than for anybody else, that it was a space for healing, a space for finding community with other people. So I kind of pivoted after that. Ariadne left the podcast because she has a full-time job and she's doing her music. So it's a lot. And you know how much work podcasting is.
Oh, yeah.
So I've been doing the podcast alone since we're still besties, but I've been doing the podcast alone still. And yeah, it's now been 4 seasons. I'm on the 5th season, which is the limited series where I have you as a guest.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I love how the podcast evolved kind of from in the beginning. Was thinking about catering towards the white gays, like trying to make them feel like we ask them to respect us, but then transitioned into like just building community for our own people, fuck the white gays and all of that.
Yeah, because I realized that the white people who were listening, I don't need to do that for them.
Oh yeah.
So,
yeah, the people who want to learn, they will.
Yeah.
And people who don't, they won't.
Yeah.
Awesome. So tell me about season 5 that is upcoming. Well, first episode's out, but rest episode's coming.
Yes. So season 5 is very different. The usual format is an interview format like MX Asian American. Season 5, I wanted to do something different. It's a limited series that's partly narrative and partly discussion. And it's called Queering Pre-Modern Asia. And it's me going through hundreds of articles and books from academia to dig up stories about queerness in pre-modern times in Asia, before Western influences, before the white people ruined it. But the inspiration for that was about a quarter of the guests that I've had have been from the queer community. And one thing that I've seen a lot is feeling like they don't belong in the queer community because the queer community is very white-centric, and also feeling like they don't fully belong in the Asian community because the Asian community is very homophobic and transphobic. And one day I was scrolling on TikTok and I found a video about a lesbian play that was written in 1651 in China that was a huge hit back in the day. And I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. 1651, that was a long time ago. And if that was a hit play, what else could have been there? I'm sure there's got to be other stories. So I started looking around and I found more and more stories. And I thought, how cool would it be if queer Asian kids growing up would have these stories that they could know about, that they would know that they're not alone. Because the other thing too is, in the Asian community, it's a lot harder for people to come out. It's a lot harder for people to come out if they know their family is very homophobic or transphobic. And I have seen people who are still in the closet, so to speak, who are too scared to come out, and how much pain that brings, right? And I've also heard from people who said that growing up, they thought that there was something wrong with them, that they were the only ones feeling this way, that, you know, they were ashamed to talk about it. They didn't know that there was support. They didn't know that other people were feeling the same thing. And so I thought maybe this would be a cool way to, provide stories that people could relate to, that even if they can't talk about it, at least there's stories that can help them feel a little less alone. But also maybe it might be a way to open up conversations with people from the Asian community who are a bit more, you know, transphobic or homophobic. To be like, hey, you know, our culture wasn't always homophobic or transphobic. There are these stories that are in our archives. This is how it all changed. And preserving our culture doesn't necessarily mean we have to preserve that part of it, that part that is homophobic or transphobic. And, you know, there's a lot of this already known in academia, but how many people outside of academia knows about it? Very little. So I thought it would be cool to have sort of a centralized body of work that brings all those stories together. And also in academia, a lot of times people are very focused on one area, one time period, you know, one region. And I wanted something that is a bit more broad, that people can find the common through lines and hopefully, you know, bring diverse stories all together and show that at the end of the day, it was everywhere. Yeah.
No, I love this. We need a sticker that says, "Before the white people ruined it." Merch? Question mark.
Stickers.
But yeah, I really love this, and I'm really excited for this season. And speaking of academia, I feel like a lot of knowledge is gatekept in academia, and whether it be the institution of academia or scholars, but you have to write in a way that isn't necessarily accessible for everybody. And I love that was right hard. I bet it was really hard to read those papers.
Yeah, some of them were a lot harder to read than others. Like some of the books, they're really good, but you have to sit with them.
Oh yeah.
You know?
I think what you're doing with this season is that you're democratizing kind of knowledge and like making it more accessible to everybody, which, you know, is hard work.
Yeah.
Valuable.
You know, one of the guests I had, who is a gay Filipino sommelier, he was talking about how the language of wine needs to be democratized, right? There's a certain, like, diversity in wine isn't just bringing more people of color on your ads or in your winery. It's also diversifying the language we use when we are talking about wine, diversifying the settings in which wine is enjoyed. And so I really take that to heart in what I'm doing with this season as well. It's like, we shouldn't have to have a master's degree or a PhD to be able to access those stories. And also, I've paid to buy those books and, you know, or have access to some of those things. Like, academic books are not cheap. And so that's another way that it's gatekept, right? Because, I mean, I understand that people took 5 years or whatever to write those books, and, you know, it was a lot of work. But they're
really expensive.
For sure. But how do you expect a teenage Asian kid to access that when they need it the most, right? And so I hope that in this format, it's approachable. I try to make the language relatable to, a younger generation, even though I'm not so young anymore, but I try. I'm on TikTok all the time.
Oh my gosh, that's better than me. I'm not on TikTok. Yeah, but speaking of, while you were researching for this season, were there any like research practices you tried to keep in mind?
Yeah, first of all, I have to say I'm not an academic. I only have a bachelor's degree in computer science. And some people say that's the worst because computer science people are obnoxious, but I'm sorry. Anyway,
You're different. I can attest to that.
But I am trying to both preserve what the academic discourse was. So, I think sometimes when I've seen blogs online that talk about those stories, it seems like it was forced sometimes to have a lens of the modern queer discourse, right? And I tried not to do that with my research. I tried not to read it in a way that I wanted to read it, but really try to dig into what it was in the context of the time as far as the scholars could tell. But again, we can never fully remove our current lens, right? We live in this time, not in pre-modern Asia. So, of course, we can never fully appreciate how these stories were understood at the time. But I do try my best. And in terms of the other practices, I would say I have struggled to keep focus on pre-modern Asia and queer stories in pre-modern Asia, because one of the things that happens when you have a project like this is scope creep, because people, there's a lot of stories out there that are really interesting, and some of them are not quite pre-modern. They're maybe a little bit after the modern period starts, or sometimes they're not quite about queerness, but there's a link in terms of how queerness and maybe feminist movements, coalesce together. There's so much stuff that I could include, and it was really, really, really hard to cut down and decide what to include and what not to include.
Yep.
And I think what has helped me is to get an idea. I started sketching out the episodes, like what the titles of the episodes would be, and sort of getting a frame of reference for how I want to create the narrative so that it feels like there's a flow, not just like putting a bunch of random stuff together. And I wanted it to feel like a series, not just individual stories. Like I wanted there to be a flow to the stories. So I ended up with 9 episodes. The first one is out, and there's 8 more to go.
Woohoo! Yeah, I definitely agree with your point about how a lot of people tend to read research, scholarly articles, or even like stories from the past, like with their current lens on. Just disregarding historical context. But yeah, historical context is super important. I guess closing question, kind of. Do you have any aspirations for Nuances and also for your own music?
For Nuances, I hope it continues to grow and reach more people. I think it would be awesome if a lot of people from the queer community heard this particular limited series. I would have loved to have the time and resources to commission historically accurate music for this series, but I did not have the budget nor the time. So maybe someday. As a musician, I think that would be really cool, but it's very niche, very niche. For my music, I I have been working on my first solo record in a long time. So I have a duo with my husband that's a jazz influenced singer-songwriter duo called 23rd Hour. But I haven't done a lot of solo music since, well, I've done a few singles. I haven't done like an album. So I've been working slowly on an album. I have a lot of things that I want to write about that are from what I've seen on the podcast. But to me, things need to stew a little bit before I can write it down. And I think it's still stewing.
I completely understand that feeling when I know a poem is coming, but I still need to sit with it for a little bit. Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on the show. I'm so excited for season 5 of Nuances. Where can listeners find you, support you, connect with you online?
Yeah, so you can find Nuances, our Asian stories, anywhere you get podcasts. On social media, we're Nuances Pod. And the podcast website is nuancespod.com. And the next episode of the series will have Karen as my co-host.
Woohoo!
Super excited for that. And yeah, because I'm cis straight, I felt it was really important that I bring on co-hosts from the queer Asian community to talk about those stories. I didn't feel comfortable talking about them just by myself.
Yeah, that was very respectful of you to do so. And I had so much fun with being a co-host on that episode. So excited to see it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.